Okay, so I have a mix that I've created in Reaper, and I want to go through into the mastering process. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is take my existing mix and render it as a stereo file. So I'm going to go up to File, select Render, and here I'm going to choose my master mix. I'm going to choose the entire project, and I'm also going to include a tail. And the reason why this tail is selected is because there's a reverb track here, and this reverb is going to ring out beyond the end of the last track. And so we need like an extra second for that reverb to die out before finishing our render. So our rendered file will be the length of our entire project plus 1 second. You can tweak that here if you need to. I'm going to select a wave output format. So it's important at this point that you export this as a full quality uncompressed audio file, right? Because we're going to take this uncompressed audio file and put it into our another Reaper section to do the mastering process on it. So I'm choosing my master mix. I'm doing the entire project. I've got tail selected. I'm exporting as a wave file. I always use 48 kilohertz sample rate. You can use a higher sampling rate if you want to. I wouldn't go lower than 48. You could do 441 if you want. Not that unusual. Make sure it's wave. I'm going to leave it at 24 bits, which is the default bit depth for this project, so I'm not going to change that yet. And I'm going to hit render one file, and it's going to render it to the same folder where my project is. So I'm going to go ahead, Pinto Stems final mix. Okay, so now I'm going to close this, and I'm going to make a new Reaper file, and I'm going to find that final mix, and I'm going to drag it in here. All right, so at this point, what I want to do is I want to find some reference tracks to drag in and use to compare my final mix with. So actually for our lab, we do have a already provided set of files which is there to give you sort of something to play with. I'm going to grab the reference tracks from this. If you wanted to experiment with doing the mastering process, you could grab all three of these, and the track you'd be mastering is Pinto Loop. But I already have the Pinto exported here, so I'm just going to grab our reference tracks and drag them into Reaper and drag this back to the beginning. Okay. So right away I can see that these tracks are longer. So one kind of trick here is you want to make sure that these tracks should be shorter than your existing track, because you're going to render this and you're going to render it as the sort of entire project. So it's going to be, the rendered file is going to be the same length as this file. The rendered file is going to be the same length as the longest file in your project, basically. So we're in our mastering file. So what's going on here is we have 3 complete tracks, and we're going to compare our master with some reference masters. Now, the easiest way to do this is mute all of these tracks, so you're not going to hear anything when you hit play. And then solo your track. So now we can hear this track is playing. And if I zoom in, I can also hear the reverb. Now you can hear actually that the reverb extends for longer than a second, right? It's actually quite a long decay time for this reverb. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off clip so I can move this really freely and add a fade out. It's kind of a little bit of an artificial fade because our track is such a long reverb on a very sort of percussive track. But you just need to tweak this so it fades out what you would consider to be naturally. And that sounds okay to me. Okay. So now that I've done that, I can come in here and I can unmute one of these tracks. So now this is soloed, so we're going to listen to our solo track, and our solo track is always going to be sort of the only thing that we hear. Now if I unsolo this, now we're going to listen to this track because it's the only track that's unmuted. And the nice thing about this, if I go ahead and turn looping on, is I can just go back and forth between these 2 tracks just by clicking one button. So that is sort of like the default way that I kind of work in this, because I like to go back and forth a lot just to make sure that I'm really getting the levels correct and sort of comparing them side by side. I'm going to make sure this loop is the whole length so we can have a little bit more time to listen before it repeats. Okay, so now that I've got my master in here and I've got my reference tracks as well, I can add some effects. So just like with mixing, Reaper has a bunch of effects that are standard for the mastering process. The one that is mandatory is a limiter. And the point of the limiter, and the master limiter is what we're going to use. The point of the limiter is to get the loudness of our track so it's relatively the same loudness as our reference. Now in this instance, this track Atlas is a very different track. It's actually a lot fuller than our Pinto Stems track. So I'm actually going to use Palm Grease as my reference for loudness. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to set my limit. So this is the maximum loudness that is going to be available to our track. I'm going to set to minus 1 dB. It's sort of good practice to keep it below 0 dB. Even though 0 dB is theoretically the maximum, minus 1 dB just gives us a little bit of extra headroom without really affecting our dynamic range at all. And now what's going to happen is as I pull my threshold down, it's going to increase the volume of our track. And then every time the peaks of our track, so we can tell that there are, if we zoom in a little bit, these peaks right here, especially things like that, are going to get compressed when this exceeds minus 1 dB. And it's actually not going to get compressed, it's going to get limited. It means it's going to be just chopped off. But it's chopped off with a little bit of a curve to it so it doesn't actually make a distortion in the way we'd expect like hard clipping to make it to happen. It actually does have a little bit of an attack and release time going on here to help make this be a little bit less sonically disruptive. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play. So I can tell that my reference track is louder. So I'm going to pull down my threshold. You'll hear pulling down your threshold automatically brings your volume up, because what the threshold is doing is it's setting this value. It's forcing everything, every like minus 6 dB. It's basically adding 6 dB of volume to your track as you're pulling it down to make it so that the threshold is actually always going to be this value right here. So I'm going to pull it down. I'm going to just keep going back and forth between my reference and my master track. And try to get it in the right ballpark. Notice you can also see when the limiter kicks in, you'll see a reduction in this sort of reduction meter here. You can see it happen a couple times right there, right? So that's normal, and that's kind of like, you know, a typical thing. Now, this track isn't a particularly loud track, so there's no reason why it needs to be hitting the limiter up particularly hard. If you're doing something like a really hard, heavy track that's very loud, you might hit the limiter a little bit harder than this. Okay, so this is your required plugin. Now, you can add other things in the mastering stage, and actually one of the things that I do like to do is add just a regular Gardner Variety EQ, and use that EQ to tweak the sound. Now I got to make sure that the master limiter is at the bottom of my chain. So the master limiter should be the last thing in your chain, because this is the thing that sets the actual fixed output volume for your track. So I come in here, and now I can make pretty drastic changes to EQ with only a little bit of change. So notice that your amount of reduction is right here. So minus 2, minus 3 dB is about as much as I would do. I also would avoid boosting EQ at this stage. I would just cut EQ. So if you want the track to be brighter, instead of boosting in the high frequencies, pull back in the low frequencies to help smooth the, to help add brightness. And again, I'm going to compare to my reference. pretty common that you're going to want is really try to match. Brightness is the thing that's the hardest to get. Actually, if I was to go back and mix this again, I think I could probably get this track to be a little bit brighter in the mixing stage. If you need to apply too much EQ in the mastering stage, normally that's a sign you should go back and fix it in the mix. And this is sort of one of the back and forths that sometimes you will end up doing. But in this instance, I'm going to sort of let this be okay for now. I'm going to try another plugin. So just like with mixing, EQ is sort of a normal thing you might want to add. Something else you might want to add is compression. And there's two kinds of compression you might use. You could just use a regular garden variety compressor, like Recomp. And again, I'm going to make sure it's before my master limiter. So I'm going to put it after the EQ. And now I can just add regular compression. So I might do this in a couple different ways just to help make it so that the louder instruments like those kick drums and snare drums, they get pulled back and the track sort of like evens out dynamically. There's a couple different ways you could approach doing compression at this stage. Sometimes you might want to just do a longer release just to kind of smooth the overall volume out. I like to use the shorter release time so it's a little bit punchier, and you can kind of hear that the whole track still feels like rhythmic. When I have a longer release, sometimes I feel like it smooths things out. You can even hear like when the snare drum hits, the volume drops, and then you'll hear the volume kind of fade back in as the compressor releases. So again, I sort of keep, especially in this phase, kind of like a nice tight attack and release. Okay, so I could use a regular compressor if I wanted to, or I could use a multi-band compressor. So the multi-band compressor here is Re-X-Comp. And a multi-band compressor, just like a regular compressor, is going to have threshold and ratio controls, but it's going to have 4 separate bands of compression. You can actually even add more if you want to. What I normally do at this point is I'm going to go through to all 4 bands and disable the compressor. And now this should be no change at all to the sound, right? And the best use for a multi-band compressor is to take the bottom end of your track, the kick drum, the bass drum, and even out that low end so that it's really consistent. And especially if you're working with live tracks from musicians, there might be moments where like the kick drum and the bass, like the total bass energy kind of varies depending on what's going on. And so a multi-band compressor, it lets you, first of all, just even out the bass level for the whole track. And secondly, even boost it a little bit more, because sometimes it's nice to have a lot of bass energy, but you want to make sure that you don't have any bass notes that just get too loud. And this is an opportunity to kind of smooth that out. So I'm in my channel 1, which is my bass channel. Now I'm going to set my top frequency quite a bit lower. I think actually the bass channel should normally be like somewhere between 90 and 110 hertz. To really focus only on the kick drum and the bass and those really low frequencies, and not so much where the vocals and the guitars and the other kinds of instruments might live. I can actually solo just the band so you can really hear what we're working with here. So I got a ratio here of around 2, not too extreme. Now as I pull the threshold down, notice the track is getting louder because we have auto makeup going on by default. So what this does is as I bring my threshold down, it turns the gain up in order to compensate. This is okay in this context, although you have to be really careful because this will radically change your mix, right? You're basically changing the mix at this point by turning the bass up because of this auto makeup gain. I oftentimes will turn it off by default and set the gain here manually. I'm going to go ahead and leave this on for now. Now over here, you can see the input and output volume of your track, and you'll also see the middle is a little gain reduction, which is showing you the compressor the impact the compressor is having on the sound. Now I'm going to have to turn the threshold down quite a bit. And now we can see some of that compression kicking in, right? But notice that the auto makeup gain made my bass way too loud, so I got to turn that off. And now I can control my gain myself. So that's kind of a classic use for a multiband compressor. As with all of these things, there's a lot of settings you can play around with. You can use your ears. My recommendation is start simple. Start with sort of like the default settings. Play around. Don't be too extreme, right? It's easy to be too extreme in the moment, and then you go back the next day and you're like, oh, there's something really weird about this mix because I used the multiband compressor in a way, and I overdid it by leaving that auto makeup gain on, and the bass is super, super loud, and I don't want it to be. It's easy to sort of go a little bit crazy. So I would say start off kind of simple, make small tweaks, and then come back the next day and see what you think. All right, so I've got my EQ dialed in. I've got my compressor dialed in. I've got my master limiter set up. I'm going to make sure, I'm just going to do another couple of quick ABs with my reference tracks just to make sure that things are sounding at the right level, and also kind of tonally, the frequency response of my track is still sounding good. So this is an older track from the 70s. It doesn't have the amount of bass that you might expect from a modern production. This is a more modern track. So let's compare the bass levels here. I think probably the bass is a little bit exaggerated. I'm going to pull it back like a half a dB. So this is the moment where you might have to decide, things are different. These are different tracks. They actually sound very different in a lot of ways. So you're trying to match your reference track as closely as you can, but sometimes your track wants to sound different because it's a different piece. I'm going to say that this is okay for now, and I'm going to leave my track soloed, and now I'm going to render this as a master. So this is my Pinto master, and I'm going to save it as 48K. Now at this point, I'm actually going to set it as a 16-bit. Kind of when you're exporting your final master, 16-bit is okay quality. 24-bit is better when you're sort of during the recording process, but at the output, 16-bit's okay. Or you could also decide you want to export it as an MP3. And if you do export it as an MP3, you probably want the bit rate to be at the maximum, 320 kilobytes per second, so there's not too much lossy compression taking place. The last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to say add rendered items to new tracks and project so that I can see it. It's going to import it in here, and I can take a look visually and see that the levels are going to be really different and much more similar to our reference tracks. I'm also going to turn off the tail because there's no reverb in this track. I don't want the track to have an extra amount of like empty silence at the end of the track. I want the track to end when the track ends because there's no reverb to worry about. All right, so I'm going to hit render. Here's my rendered track. I'm going to close that, and here is my master. So if I drag this up, we can compare our mastered track versus our unmastered track. It should be a lot louder, and you should see the peaks are much higher than they were. They should compare probably to this track. So these two tracks should look kind of like in the same ballpark as far as the loudness, and it really does. Like you can see that we matched it pretty well right there. All right, and at that point, I can solo just my mastered track. And that sounds pretty good. And then you are done with your master.